For this week's video journal, I conducted an FBA interview with two teachers actually that I work with. One is a special education teacher that teaches a self-contained ELA class, and the other is a general ed math teacher. So when I asked these teachers these questions, they both saw pretty similar behavior. The one teacher stated that she saw the behavior more before writing tasks, which seemed to be a non-preferred activity, where the math teacher stated that it seems like more any independent work time. She sees the behavior, and the behavior looks like calling out without raising their hand, or calling out even while his hand is raised, roaming around the room, arguing with classmates. And when things like this happen, he often shuts down. And when directed to perform a task or prompted to get back on task, and it's the behavior that is most problematic is that he shuts down and refuses to comply with non-preferred tasks. And when this happens, he cries, and it's distracting to his peers, but also it takes him a fair amount of time to recover and be able to get back on task or back in the room. And when you give him direction, sometimes he sits there and does nothing, even if it's part of his class routine. For example, in his ELA and reading class, they have the same routine every day where they work in table groups with word sorts. And he often goes back in the classroom and sits at the back table. And when you prompt him to go join his table, he sometimes just ignores you and refuses to move. Or when he does finally move, he'll sit at a different table by himself rather than the table that he was instructed to sit at, until he finally will comply. But it seems like he tries to get into a power struggle. And then it will argue with his peers at the table group as well. And when you ask him, like, hey, it looks like you need a break, like, why don't you step outside, because he's crying and it's disrupting to the class, he'll even refuse to move from his seat and just stay in his seat and cry. And this goes on for several minutes usually. So when does the problem most occur? I kind of already stated this, but a lot of times before tests, before writing tasks, or pretty much before any non-preferred activity, or when the student is directed to work independently, as independent work in general is kind of a non-preferred activity. And what happens when the individual engages in the behavior? Try to have the conversation with the student, but he typically doesn't respond. So typically it seems like what he's getting out of the behavior is just work avoidant. He's getting out of doing the work and wastes a lot of time that way. So I also already kind of stated this, but it's problematic because it takes a lot of one-on-one direction, so a lot of the teacher's time, but also it's distracting to his other classmates because they get frustrated with him. And also it's a problem for him because he's lacking a lot of emotional regulation. And I mean, that's kind of like our job as educators, is to help teach him those skills. So in defining the behavior, it looks like making atypical noises or sounds that are distracting to the students, shouts out without raising his hands, gets out of his seat without permission, and provides excuses when prompted to do work, such as saying, I don't have a pencil, even when there's pencils in his backpack, or he knows that there's pencils up on the board he can use. And the replacement behavior would be to quietly work and initiate work, raising his hand before sharing out or getting out of his seat, and then just having the correct materials that he needs for class rather than having to constantly leave the room to go get things. So during the interview with the teachers, they both seem to have a fairly good understanding of the child and the behavior, and shared about the behavior being problematic because of the emotional regulation and the distraction to his class. And the teachers even actually had some ideas about how we can work on this together, such as a more visual schedule and then implementing some type of reward system as well. So no cultural issues seemed to arise, but it was a bit of a challenge to have them be able to describe the behavior in detail. And that wraps up the FBA behavior interview.